Lila's heart pounded as she stood in the alley, her breath ragged, the cold night air stinging her skin. The harsh words echoed in her mind, the ones her father had thrown at her just hours before. "You're nothing," he had said, his voice dripping with disdain. She had always tried to make him proud, even when life had shoved her into the dark corners of the world, but it was never enough. Her mother had long since disappeared, leaving her to fend for herself. Lila had to work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, all while enduring the cruelty of those who saw her as less than human. She thought about her dreams, the ones she held close to her heart, of a life where she wasn't drowning in poverty and disappointment. But those dreams felt further away than ever now. She had been saving for years, putting every penny aside for something better, but even that felt pointless now. As the wind whipped through the narrow alley, Lila clenched her fists, not just from the cold, but from the weight of the world pressing down on her. But no matter how bad things got, she couldn't let go of the one thing she still had: hope. With her back pressed against the brick wall, she took a deep breath, the air bitter in her lungs. Tomorrow, she would keep fighting. Because that was all she knew how to do: fight. But tonight, she wondered if that fight would ever be enough. The next morning, Lila woke up to the harsh reality of her situation. Her small, dimly lit apartment offered little comfort, just peeling wallpaper and an old mattress on the floor. As she sat up, the weight of exhaustion from another sleepless night pressed heavily on her shoulders. She glanced at the clock, 6:00 a.m. Another long day of work awaited her. But for Lila, it was just another day in the cycle of struggle and survival. She had dreams, but they always seemed just out of reach, like a distant star taunting her. For now, survival was her only focus. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the mental fog. She didn't have time to feel sorry for herself. There was no one else to rely on but herself. The world may have forgotten about her, but she was determined not to let it break her. With a sigh, she stood up, preparing to face the day ahead. She had to work, and she had to endure. The day was a blur of activity, working 2 jobs, running errands, barely having time to eat or rest. Lila's body ached, but it was a familiar feeling. It had become second nature to her to push through the pain and exhaustion, to keep moving even when her body screamed for relief. Her first job, serving coffee at a local cafe, was draining, but it paid enough for her to get by. The second job, working late at a laundromat, was less glamorous but necessary. She didn't have time for anything else, no hobbies, no friends, just the grind of survival. As she folded clothes, her mind wandered to the few fleeting moments of peace she allowed herself. The rare breaks between jobs when she could close her eyes and dream of a better life. But those moments were few and far between. She couldn't afford to dream for long. That night, after finishing her second job, Lila finally returned to her apartment. She collapsed onto the mattress, too tired to even change into her pajamas. The hum of the city outside her window was a constant reminder of how small and insignificant her life felt. But, despite the fatigue, there was a fire within her that refused to die. She would continue to fight. She had no other choice. The next morning, she would do it all over again. Another day of sacrifice, of working hard for nothing more than the bare minimum. But Lila had learned not to expect anything else. All she wanted now was a moment of peace, even if it was only in her dreams. Lila woke up the next morning to the sound of her alarm blaring. She had barely slept, but she couldn't afford to waste time. As she got dressed and prepared for another day, she found herself staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She looked so different now, tired, worn down, but still fighting. She wondered if anyone could see the person she used to be, the girl with dreams before the world had chipped away at her. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of sorrow for the life she had lost. But that feeling quickly faded. She didn't have time for self-pity. Today she had to survive, just like every other day. With a final glance at her reflection, Lila turned and walked out the door, ready to face the world once more. The days blended together in a haze of exhaustion. Lila's body was aching, and her mind was clouded with thoughts of survival, but there was no time to stop. She had always believed that hard work would pay off eventually, that if she kept giving, kept pushing, something would give her the chance to rise above her circumstances. But recently, that belief had started to waver. She was working harder than ever, but it felt like she was stuck in a cycle with no way out. Even her boss at the cafe had begun to take advantage of her, giving her extra shifts without asking, knowing that she couldn't afford to refuse. One evening, after finishing her second job, she collapsed onto her bed, her thoughts racing. "When will it ever end?" she whispered to the empty room. The weight of her sacrifices felt unbearable, and the promises she had made to herself felt more and more distant. The next day, Lila went to work with a heavy heart, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had spent so many years struggling, giving up her time, her energy, her dreams, for the people she loved. But lately, that love had felt one-sided. She noticed how her colleagues at the cafe treated her, indifferent, even dismissive of her efforts. The ting system at the cafe, designed to reward the workers who performed best, was becoming more of a joke. Lila was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, yet her tips were paltry, and her contributions went unnoticed. As she worked, she overheard a conversation between her manager and another employee. "Lila's too good at what she does," the manager said. "We don't want her getting any ideas about asking for more." The words stung, but they didn't surprise her. She had always been invisible, and it seemed that no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. That evening, as Lila walked home after another grueling shift, her mind raced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The reality of what she had overheard sank in. She was being kept in her place on purpose. She had worked so hard, given everything for so long, and yet it felt like she was always being held back, pushed down. Her dreams, which once felt so close, now seemed almost unreachable. She stopped in front of a small rundown convenience store and stared at her reflection in the glass. The girl she saw was no longer the hopeful dreamer she used to be. She had become hardened, a version of herself that only knew how to survive, not to thrive. A small part of her wondered if it was too late to change things, to break free from this endless cycle. But then the crushing weight of responsibility, the fear of failure pulled her back. Lila walked on, her heart heavy, the cold night air biting at her skin. The next morning Lila met with her best friend, Rachel, over breakfast. Rachel had always been the one person in her life who saw her for who she truly was, not just the worker or the struggler. "You need to do something about this," Rachel said, her voice filled with concern. "You can't keep putting yourself last. You've been sacrificing so much for people who don't even care." Lila had been hearing this for months now, but every time she felt a pang of guilt. How could she stop sacrificing? What kind of person would she be if she just stopped giving? "What else can I do?" Lila asked quietly, her voice cracking. "I can't just walk away. I have responsibilities, and I can't let anyone down." Rachel sighed, leaning across the table and taking Lila's hand. "Sometimes you have to put yourself first, Lila. You deserve better." But Lila wasn't ready to hear it. She couldn't. The guilt would always weigh on her. Still, Rachel's words stayed with her, stirring a long-hidden desire for change. That evening, Lila made her way back home after another long shift. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally. Her mind kept returning to Rachel's words, "You deserve better." She hadn't really allowed herself to believe it, but now, in the stillness of the night, she wondered if there was any truth to them. Could she really stop sacrificing? Could she fight for herself? The thought was terrifying. For years, she had been so focused on helping others, carrying the weight of everyone around her, but no one had ever stepped up for her in the same way. Maybe it was time to change that. But how could she, when she had nothing left to give? She passed by the same alley where she had stood just days ago, feeling defeated. But this time something was different. The cold air didn't seem as biting, and the shadows didn't seem as dark. Maybe it was just the flicker of hope in her chest, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could do something for herself. Lila's days started to change after the conversation with Rachel. She began to look at her life differently, questioning the endless cycle of sacrifice she had become trapped in. At work, she no longer let her manager take advantage of her without protest, though her voice still trembled whenever she spoke up. But it wasn't just at work where things began to shift. One afternoon, as she walked home from her second job, Lila passed by a store window and stopped. Her reflection caught her off guard. She looked different, tired, yes, but there was also a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A small part of her wondered if Rachel had been right all along. Could she really change her life? But the bigger shock came when she received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, her estranged aunt, someone who had always been distant but was now reaching out. "Lila," her aunt said, "I need to tell you something." The words that followed would shatter everything Lila thought she knew about her family, her past, and the choices she had made. "Lila, I don't know how to say this, but I owe you an apology," her aunt continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I was the one who kept your mother's secrets from you. The ones she didn't want you to know. Your father wasn't the man you thought he was. He was involved in things, bad things, and he was trying to protect you, even if it meant keeping you in the dark. Your mother—" Her aunt's voice faltered, as though she was unsure how much to reveal. Lila's heart raced as the words began to sink in. Everything she had known, everything she had lived through, felt like a lie. Her mother had always been absent, but to hear that her father was hiding the truth about their past felt like a betrayal. The foundation of her life had just cracked, and the weight of those revelations left her feeling lost. The burden of love, her sacrifices for the people she cared about, had all been for nothing. How could she keep fighting when the people she trusted most had kept so many secrets from her? The conversation with her aunt left Lila reeling. She spent the rest of the night pacing her small apartment, struggling to process the information. Could it really be true? She had always known that something about her family's past felt off. But this was more than she could have ever imagined. The weight of the truth was suffocating. What was she supposed to do with this new information? What did it mean for everything she had sacrificed for her father and mother? She had given up so much of herself, fighting for their love, and now she learned that the very people she had fought for had kept her in the dark. She thought about her father, the man who had raised her, who had taught her the value of hard work. But what was that worth now? Was it all just a lie? Lila sank to the floor, her mind spinning, unable to make sense of the wreckage of her life. The next day Lila couldn't bring herself to go to work. The thought of pretending everything was fine, of continuing with the charade, felt unbearable. Instead, she walked aimlessly through the streets, lost in her own thoughts. The city, once a backdrop to her daily grind, now felt like a cold, uncaring place. She passed by a familiar park, one where she had spent time with her mother when she was younger, and for a fleeting moment, the memories of those days overwhelmed her. But they were memories that now seemed tainted. How could she trust anything she had been told? She stopped at the park's edge, staring at the empty swings swaying in the wind. A sense of abandonment washed over her, and she realized that she had been carrying the weight of a lie for so long. How much longer could she keep bearing it? After hours of wandering, Lila returned home, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. The weight of her aunt's words pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. She knew she couldn't keep living in this state of confusion and pain. She had to know more, to uncover the truth for herself. With shaking hands, she dialed her father's number. The phone rang, and for a moment she considered hanging up. What if she wasn't ready to hear the answers? But before she could hang up, her father answered. "Lila?" His voice was familiar, but there was an edge to it now, something she hadn't noticed before. "Dad, we need to talk," Lila said, her voice trembling but firm. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Lila's heart raced as she sat in her small apartment, phone pressed to her ear. Her father's voice came through, calm but distant. "I know this must be hard to hear, Lila, but your aunt, she wasn't wrong. There are things about our past, things I've tried to protect you from." Her father's confession hit her like a punch to the gut. All these years, she had believed in his love and his guidance, but now it felt like everything had been built on a foundation of lies. The weight of his words sank in, and for the first time, Lila wasn't sure what to believe anymore. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. There was a long pause before her father replied, his voice cracking. "Because I wanted to protect you. I never wanted you to carry that burden." But Lila knew better now. The burden had already been placed on her shoulders, and it had shaped her life in ways she hadn't realized until now. She had given everything, loved without question, and yet she had been left in the dark. How could she continue loving, sacrificing, when her foundation had been built on deception? The days after that conversation were filled with a suffocating silence. Lila's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her life that no longer seemed to fit together. She couldn't focus on work, couldn't bring herself to face her father again. Not yet. She needed time. The betrayal, the secrecy, it all felt like a crushing weight on her chest. She began to wonder if her sacrifices had ever truly mattered, or if she had been living in someone else's shadow all along. But as she walked through the city, lost in thought, something began to shift inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to please others, to make up for the things they couldn't give her. But maybe it was time to put herself first, to break free from the chains of obligation and discover who she really was. Lila knew it wasn't going to be easy. The road to healing, to self-discovery, was long and uncertain. But for the first time, she realized that it was a journey worth taking. Lila spent the next few days reflecting on everything she had learned, piecing together the puzzle of her life. The weight of the betrayal from her father felt heavy, but as she allowed herself to process the truth, something shifted within her. She realized she could no longer live in the past, shackled by guilt and sorrow. There were pieces of her life that had been taken from her, but she still had the power to rebuild. As the days went by, she began to reclaim small pieces of herself, decisions that weren't influenced by others, choices that belonged to her alone. She returned to her old dreams, the ones she had buried deep beneath the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living, about choosing her own path, even if it meant leaving behind the things she thought she had to hold on to. It was time to step into her own light, to take control of the future. As Lila prepared to confront her father once more, she knew it wasn't going to be easy. She had spent years trying to make sense of the world he had built around her, but now she realized that it wasn't about understanding him, it was about understanding herself. She wasn't the helpless girl she used to be, clinging to a distorted sense of loyalty. She was strong, capable, and deserving of her own happiness. When she arrived at her father's house, she felt the familiar wave of emotions wash over her. But this time, she didn't let them control her. She stood tall, facing him with the determination she had found in herself. "I can't keep living in this shadow," she said, her voice steady, but full of emotion. "I need to find my own way without all the lies and secrets." Her father's eyes filled with regret, but Lila could see something else in his gaze, pride. The father who had once held her back now understood that she was ready to step into her own light. As Lila left her father's house that day, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had finally found her voice, her strength, and her own path forward. There was still so much to figure out, so many questions left unanswered, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had spent so much of her life fighting for others, but now she was fighting for herself. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges, but Lila knew she had the power to face whatever came her way. Her journey wasn't over, but this was a new beginning, one where she could finally take control of her own future, free from the burden of sacrifice and the weight of others' expectations. It had been weeks since Lila confronted her father. The initial rush of freedom and the sense of clarity had given way to a quieter kind of peace. She had spent the last few days focusing on herself, taking the time to breathe, to slow down, to rest. For the first time in a long while, the weight of the world didn't feel quite so heavy. Lila had always been the one to push herself to the limit, always sacrificing her own needs for others. But now, she was beginning to understand the importance of self-care, of reclaiming her own happiness. Her relationships, including the one with her father, were shifting, but they no longer defined her. She was slowly but surely learning to let go of the expectations that had been placed on her. Each day brought a new opportunity to define herself on her own terms. She knew that her journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was walking her own path. Lila spent the next few weeks reconnecting with herself. She had always kept busy, never allowing herself the luxury of rest, but now she found solace in moments of stillness. One afternoon, while taking a walk through the park, she noticed how the trees swayed gently in the breeze, how the sun felt warm on her skin. It was the first time in a long while that she had truly felt at peace in the world. There were still things she needed to figure out: her future, her career, and how to heal the rift with her father. But for the first time in a long time, Lila wasn't afraid of what was ahead. She had learned to stop living in the shadows of her past, and was beginning to accept that her story didn't have to be defined by what others wanted for her. It was her story now, and she could shape it however she wished. Lila returned to her job at the cafe, but this time, things were different. She no longer allowed the stress or the long hours to drain her. She had learned that her happiness wasn't contingent on her job or how others perceived her. As she worked, she interacted with her colleagues differently, more confidently, with a calm energy that they hadn't seen before. The manager, who had once taken advantage of her, began to notice the change. "Lila, I've got to say, you've really stepped up lately." "I'm impressed," he remarked one day. For a moment, Lila was caught off guard by the compliment. She had always worked hard, but now her work felt like it was for her, not for validation. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She was doing it for herself. And that realization, simple as it was, brought a quiet joy that she hadn't experienced in a long time. One evening, after finishing her shift, Lila sat on the steps outside the cafe, the world bustling around her. She thought about everything she had been through, the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the betrayals. But she also thought about the strength she had gained, the lessons she had learned. She was no longer the same girl who had walked into the alley months ago, full of doubt and fear. She had transformed into someone stronger, more resilient. And as she looked up at the stars above, she realized that while the past had shaped her, it no longer defined her. Lila was ready to create her own future, one step at a time. And that future, she knew, would be full of possibilities. Lila's journey wasn't over, but she had found peace in the uncertainty. She had learned that life was never about perfection, and that sometimes the only thing you could control was your own choices. She had forgiven herself for the things she couldn't change and embraced the strength she had found in her struggles. Her relationship with her father was still strained, but it was healing. Slowly. She was learning to build her life from the ground up, not on the expectations of others, but on the foundation of her own dreams. With each passing day, Lila was becoming more of the person she had always been beneath the layers of sacrifice and self-doubt. Someone worthy of love, worthy of happiness, and worthy of the future she had always dreamed of. The weeks that followed were filled with new challenges, but Lila felt more grounded than ever. She had rebuilt parts of her life, taken ownership of her dreams, and let go of the past. But one thing still weighed on her: the betrayal. Her former friend, Sarah, had always been a confidant, someone Lila trusted like family. But when the truth came to light, Sarah had been a part of the betrayal that tore Lila's world apart. Lila hadn't seen Sarah in months, but the weight of the unresolved conflict hung between them, like a dark cloud. One evening, Sarah reached out. "Lila, we need to talk," Sarah's message read. It was a simple request, but the gravity of it felt unbearable. Lila hesitated, torn between the desire to confront the woman who had hurt her and the fear of reopening old wounds. But deep down, she knew she couldn't move forward without this confrontation. It was time to face Sarah and decide whether there was any possibility of forgiveness, or if the past would forever define their fractured relationship. The meeting was set. Lila arrived at the coffee shop, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had made her peace with the idea of confronting Sarah, but the reality of it felt different. Sarah was already sitting at a corner table, her posture defensive, as though she had been waiting for this moment. Lila took a seat across from her, and for a long moment, they just stared at each other. Neither spoke. Lila could see the guilt in Sarah's eyes, but there was something else there, fear. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen the way it did," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, and Lila could see that the weight of her actions had begun to sink in. "I was jealous of you, Lila. I never thought it would go this far." Lila's heart ached. The betrayal wasn't just about the lies, it was about the friendship they had lost, the trust that could never be repaired. "You took everything from me," Lila said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I let you." The conversation between Lila and Sarah continued, each word pulling them further into the depths of their fractured friendship. Sarah's apologies felt empty, her excuses weak. Lila listened quietly, but in her heart, she knew the truth. Sarah had always been a part of her world, but now, Lila realized, she had to let go. "I can't keep carrying the weight of your mistakes, Sarah," Lila said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when you hurt me like that." Sarah's face crumpled as the weight of Lila's words sank in. "I was selfish. I know that now," Sarah whispered, her tears beginning to fall. "But I never wanted to hurt you." Lila took a deep breath, the pain of the past still lingering, but the clarity of the moment beginning to wash over her. "I loved you like a sister," Lila said, her voice steady but gentle. "But I can't forgive what you did." Sarah left the cafe in tears, and for a long while, Lila stayed in her seat, staring at the empty chair across from her. She felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The weight of the betrayal had lifted, but the emotional cost was high. It wasn't just about Sarah's actions, it was about Lila's willingness to let go, to free herself from the ties that had once bound her to someone who had hurt her so deeply. For the first time, Lila realized that forgiveness didn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant walking away, and sometimes the hardest part was giving yourself permission to do so. She stood up, paying for her coffee, and as she walked out of the cafe, she felt a sense of finality. It was over, and it was time to move on. Later that evening, as Lila sat on her bed, staring out at the city skyline, she felt the weight of the day's events settle within her. The betrayal had been a defining moment in her life, but now she realized it was also a turning point. She had made the choice to let go of the people who no longer served her, to stop holding on to the past, and to finally choose herself. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was hers to walk. And for the first time in a long while, she felt empowered, ready to face whatever came next. She had faced the betrayal, the pain, and now she was ready to move forward, free from the chains of guilt and fear. "I am enough," Lila whispered to herself, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "And I will never let anyone make me feel less than that again." Lila had made it through the storm. After weeks of confronting the truth, she was finally starting to rebuild her life. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also freed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances or her past. She was in control. The sense of loss was still there, but it was no longer the defining part of her story. Lila had learned to let go of the weight of guilt, the burden of sacrifice, and the need for others' approval. She was learning to live for herself, to carve out a future on her own terms. And as she walked through the city, her footsteps lighter than they had been in months, she realized that the journey was far from over, but she was ready to face it. One evening, as Lila sat by the window, watching the world go by, she realized that while things had changed, she hadn't forgotten the lessons she'd learned. Forgiveness, she now understood, wasn't always for others, it was for herself. It was a way to release the grip of the past and reclaim her own future. Her father had apologized, but the wounds were still there, buried deep. She would never be the same girl she was before the truth came out. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. She had learned to trust herself, to choose herself, And that was the most powerful thing of all. Lila's father had left her a message, apologizing for the years of deception. She didn't know what to make of it yet, but she had come to realize that her healing didn't depend on his apology. It depended on her ability to forgive herself. She could never undo the past, but she could decide how to move forward. She wasn't defined by the lies or the sacrifices anymore. She was her own person, with her own dreams, and she had the power to shape her future. As Lila moved forward, she realized that the future wasn't about erasing the past, it was about embracing it. Every scar, every struggle had shaped her into who she was now. And while there was still much to figure out, she no longer feared the unknown. She had learned to trust herself, to stand up for herself, and to follow her own path. Her journey was far from perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time she was content with that. In the quiet moments before bed, Lila reflected on how far she had come. She had faced betrayal, struggled with loss, and learned to fight for herself. But now, as she sat alone in her room, she understood something profound. Healing was a journey, not a destination. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and that was enough for now. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges, but for tonight, she was at peace.